Thanks for coming and very welcome, Michael Sheehy. You're the Director of Research for the Contemplative Science Center at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And I'm so glad to have you here on the No Drama Dharma podcast of the Kiense Center for Contemplative Tradition. I wish you a warm welcome to be on the podcast. It's really wonderful that you could take the time to be with us and share some of your findings about contemplative practices, what your research is leading you to, what's new, what's old, what are the texts, what are the new thoughts, what are the old thoughts, how do you bring this together? I don't even know where to start because I think it's so vast what you're doing. It's so extensive, your research, and opens up a completely new field. So I would just maybe ask you to give a short overview of what you're doing in research so that we can develop our discussion from there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me, Marco. I appreciate it. Appreciate being here and being able to talk with you and the audience. My research these days is very much grounded in experimental work, and my training is in Tibetan studies and Buddhist studies, and Tibetan studies more specifically. Really trained as a textualist, but also in philosophy and history, literature. And over the last 2 years or so, well, the last 10 years for sure, I've been involved in interdisciplinary research, working with people from different disciplines, including humanities, the sciences, but also arts and technology, and thinking through how we can understand contemplative practices and how um, we can bring historical practices into conversation with contemporary discourses. And those are discourses in philosophy and religious studies, but they're also in cognitive science and um, psychology, and they're also in conversation with the arts and technology. And over the last 2 years, as I was mentioning, I've been asked to set up a lab here at the University of Virginia at our center, the Contemplative Sciences Center, which we call the CIRCL Lab, CIRCL, Contemplative Innovation and Research Collab. And the idea is to create a collaboratorium, that is to say, a collaboratory, a space where there are multiple researchers from different disciplines, different disciplinary expertise, who come together to understand contemplative practices, very specific, discrete contemplative practices with different populations and different contexts. So we have a variety of studies up and running. And in particular, I can talk about a few of them. One, we have a study on meditation in nature. So we're very interested not just in nature, but more broadly in how environmental contexts inform contemplative practices. So, one of the questions lurking in the field of meditation research and contemplative research is how environments and context settings inform the practitioner's experience of performing a specific meditation practice. So this is an example where I bring together, my training in the historical traditions into kind of this experimental work, where I started to think, how is it that Tibetans have really thought deeply about the context in which contemplative practices are performed?
Mhm.
So the first place I looked was in the second volume of the trilogy, the three-volume trilogy by the 14th century Nyingma Dzogchen author and synthesizer of that tradition, Longchen Rabjampa. And the name is the Nyalso Korsum, or translated into English as the Trilogy of Being at Ease. And the first volume is on the mind, and the second volume is on meditation, and the third volume is on illusion. And in that second volume on meditation, which he outlines and compiles several different chapters, thematic chapters on meditation, he has one chapter that we could translate as environments, in which he's looking at and describing and prescribing different environments that meditators, meditation practitioners should go to if they want to perform in the most optimal way a specific kind of meditation. So, for instance, if you perform this kind of meditation, go to this kind of place. If you perform that kind of meditation, go to that kind of place. And it's very interesting because he's saying, the difference of meditating next to a body of water as opposed to the meditation on the top of a mountain, as opposed to meditation in the woods, as opposed to so on and so on and so forth. So these are physical environments, right? These are settings that have different qualitative characteristics. And Longchenpa goes into quite detail, actually. When you go to a mountain, and is it a mountain with crags? Is the cliff steep? Are the boulders round? So on and so on and so forth. This incredible detail, actually, around the kind of places you are and how those places affect your experience as a practitioner. And not only that, but specifically prescribing practices to perform in each specific place.
So, if I may ask, we're in the Dzogchen context, great perfection context now, and most likely this is you have quite an advanced state of practice that this is that these
So these are
environments.
all different practices. He's talking about visualization practices,
Mhm.
shamatha practices, all different kinds of practices. This is not, advanced Trekchö or Togyal type practices. These are all different types of.
Ah, okay.
So he's saying, look, if you want to practice this kind of meditation, then you go here, and that kind of meditation, you go here. If you want to develop compassion, it's in this place. And if you want to have a more visualization focus, it's this place, and so on and so forth. So he's, going through these list of different styles of contemplative practice and correlating them with physical environments. So this again is something that we have very little understanding of in contemporary discourses on contemplative practices. We don't find those kind of discussions. And we altogether, one of the critiques has been, and it doesn't just come from me, David McMahon wrote a wonderful book on this, and others, Evan Thompson has made this critique public, and so on and so forth. There are several people in the field who have said similar things, that one of the missing ingredients in the experimental, in particular scientific study of meditation, is the lack of taking context into consideration. So, because that's a critique and because that's a sort of area that needed attention, in this study, I said, okay, well, let's let's take context seriously. Let's take physical, environmental context seriously. There's all kinds of context. There's social context, there's cultural context, there's many different dimensions of context, political, economic, etc. However, let's just take into consideration the physical environmental context. So we've done that. We've designed a study that has six different conditions. Being out in nature we have a nature reserve here not far from the university. It's actually part of our university, and they go out, the practitioners, the people participating in the study go out there to practice in nature. And then there's a condition next to a pond that's a sort of semi-urban. There's a road not too far away, but they're sitting next to a pond. So this kind of semi-urban by a body of water condition. There's what we call a biophilic condition, which is in a room very much like the one I'm in now, where there's big windows and all the materials are natural wood and stone and so forth. And you're sitting staring out at the window. So, it feels like you're in nature, but you're actually inside. And we have, so that's the third condition. The fourth condition is in a simulated environment. We have a light and sound studio here where we can play the sounds of nature. And in fact, they're the same sounds as the first condition of recorded
Mhm.
in nature, where the practitioners go in the first condition. But then all the other sense stimuli are not nature, right? They're in a confined room and so on and so forth. So what is it just to have the sonic stimuli of nature? And then in a white room condition, that is to say, a room that many of us spend most of our lives, right?
Yeah.
Where there's no natural light, it's artificial light, the walls are plain, and, you know,
And these are generally the rooms that, I mean, the neurological studies on meditation have been done inside so far, right?
exactly,
Where
many
like laboratory
laboratory
kind of,
type setting. That's
yeah.
exactly, it's in our lab here. And then we have a sixth condition, which is a control group, but where they're practicing a slightly different style of meditation, just for comparative purposes. They're practicing conventional mindfulness. So that's the other point I'll mention is I'm very interested in this coupling of what is at the heart of what this Dzogchen author, Longchenpa, was prescribing, which is that there are different practices that sync you up to different environments, or not necessarily sync you up, but that are more conducive within, right? So, what we have designed here, and one of the things we do in our lab is contemplative design work. So, we're looking at the fundamental principles of contemplative practices, and then we're designing new practices or practices specific to looking at the kind of features of experience that we're most interested in. So this case, we call it an open sensorial meditation practice. There's a whole style of meditation in the scientific literature called open monitoring, which this could be broadly conceived of, but that's a very generic category. And in this practice, the practitioners are all undergo the same meditation guidance, and they're invited to sit very openly with their senses open to the environment in which they're in. So whatever they're hearing, whatever they're smelling, whatever they're tasting, whatever they're seeing, etc., right? So it's not the typical mindfulness instruction, which is like follow your breath, and if your mind wanders, come back to your breath. And it's this kind of like top-down kind of
Hmm.
control um, operation. Instead, it's a very different style of meditation. So, anyways, that is one study, and that's an example of how we're looking at historical contemplative literature, and then we're bringing into experimental design and contemplative design work. And then we will look at neurophysiological measures. So we look at EEG and heart rate, so brain waves and heart rate variability. And then we conduct self-report measures. So we ask them to report prior to each and post each meditation session. And then we have what's called ecological momentary assessment, this kind of app that they download on their phone. And then throughout their daily life, they track different um, assessments that they're prompted towards. And then we have phenomenological interviews. So we do these kind of very granular level phenomenology
Mhm.
with people. So that's the kind of thing we're doing. Yeah.
And that's really a quite different take from what other projects have been doing. It's quite thrilling actually. I mean, like even in cultural studies that in Germany we often link to, phenomenology is kind of seen as a lower kind of philosophical approach and like something to be abandoned. That's what I was taught. And that's not my critique. I think it's actually extremely valuable because, to my perception, the whole or a big part of the experiential tradition that is also be found in texts is based on these descriptions, on actual people's experience and the handing over of the experience from generation or from person to person. So this actually is what consists a living experience and a living tradition in my view. And I think phenomenology in a modern kind of way is actually also a good tool to get hold of this experience and to make use of this and to understand also the textual traditions that also I, as a trained philologist, work with on a daily basis, then actually to get a little bit under the hood and not only see it as sterile matter, but as something that actually changed people's lives and had a great impact on their well-being and also maybe also led them into mental development and human development. So this, I think, is very interesting that you come from this point of view, and that's something we try to do also in Leipzig to incorporate personal experience, though on a much smaller and different scale. But we try to also bring in this component. That's also why I love to chat about practice, about the craft of the doing of meditation, of contemplation. That is not something to remain in the books and to go into articles that scholars read out to other scholars, but actually that it does have an impact and that there can be useful insights from this. So I think this is really interesting, and I've never really heard about this passage of Longchen. I know there's the famous chapter on geomancy by Karma Chakme in his Richo, where he kind
Right.
of describes the environment that you should settle in when you
Yeah.
meditate. So there's like all these conditions that you're supposed to see as conducive for your practice, but not as like go to this scenery or this place and um, stimulate this one aspect of experience. So, and
That's right.
that's
Yeah.
quite. I need to read the passage.
Yeah. So I think back to the phenomenology, we are at a moment in the study of the human mind, consciousness, we can call it. And I think within the study of meditation, contemplative practices, more broadly conceived, that it's imperative that we have an understanding of lived experience in ways that we have neglected and omitted from inquiry in the past. And I think that this is one of the great contributions that humanists can make to this inter and transdisciplinary field of the contemplative sciences. And that we are at a moment here where, as you say, and you say rightly, that the phenomenological tradition in the past, and I presume you're thinking about Husserl and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and these, phenomenologists of the past, presented these extraordinary works, and yet there's no methodology. There's not a clear method of how you would go about doing that. And in the last few decades, there's been a few trends in the study of first person methods, right, of phenomenology that have developed ways and means, discrete methodologies for us to query and probe first person experience, subjectivity. Microphenomenology is one of them. Uh, Ecological momentary assessment is another. We use both in our lab, phenomenology being such an important measure or sort of set of measures that we're invested in both of those, which seem to be the two predominant methodologies of phenomenology. They've both been developed in the last several decades. And what we see more broadly, and I think and I hope that we continue to see this trend, is a turn towards subjectivity, a turn towards valorizing first person experience, not only as worthy of study, but of imperative and integral to our understanding of what it is to be a human. And I think now, as we embark upon this journey in contemplative sciences, which is very young, and as we're alive in a moment where artificial intelligence is dominating the discourse and is virtually changing our world, changing the consciousness of our world and how we process information, that to probe, to query in the most finessed ways what it means to be human, what it means to have a human consciousness, and more importantly, I would say, from the contemplative tradition's perspective, what it means to have human wisdom is more important, not in absolute terms, but in relative terms, given the shift towards kinds of consciousness that are not human. And I think one of the things we can do, one of the things that's hopefully happening and will continue to happen, is fields such as contemplative sciences and contemplative research will only deepen our understanding of what it means to be human, and in so doing, not only valorize it or validate it, but actually elevate it.
Mhm. Yeah, it's maybe when we are discussing in Leipzig, I think sometimes you can see it also as a chance, because the you can say the takeover of the AI will take a lot of the work or the mental work away that people have been trained in and training in today, like the production of text, the study, just the pure study of quantity. All of this can quickly be done by with a few presses of a button or just a few commands. And so I think going back to also seeing in a university context what actually motivates people to go there and what they want to find out instead of having to crank up a paper, instead of having to deliver a certain output, but also to really feed their personal interest. I think that's a way where contemplative practices or knowing about contemplative practices might come in very valuable and helpful.
Yeah, I think what these practices can provide for humans, what they have provided for humans for millennia, is a set a suite of reflective devices for us to see our own consciousness, to see our own minds. And the way that we're oriented from very, very young is to orient ourselves outwardly to a world in which we are inhabited. And we become, as we, age and go through our developmental processes, more and more habituated towards our being in a world, towards the sense stimuli that we're processing, towards the information and how we're perceiving it and processing it. And there's very little time, there's very little recognition, there's very little dedicated reflectivity or reflection of what it means to have a mind. And what these practices provide are tools to enable us to do that in a variety of different ways, that there isn't just one way to do that. And yet, because we're so deeply habituated to the world in which we're embedded, because we're so objectively outwardly oriented, because we're so unfamiliar with our own mind, there are deep-seated impulses, there are deep instinctual ways of living that have become almost alien to contemplation, as if contemplation was something that we haven't had as a species. And yet, again, in this moment where that kind of consciousness that is really just about processing pure information, which we call artificial, we now have more and more, and perhaps not only opportunity, but the speediness of our lives are inviting us for participating in this kind of reflection. So I think what we're trying to do as researchers, one of the things that we're trying to do as researchers that is at our motivation as researchers in contemplative sciences is to translate how these acts of contemplation make most sense, for whom and under what conditions. And to do so in a way that is part of the contemporary parlance, but also what that means is taking into consideration contemporary variables, variables of speediness, of high distractibility, of isolationism, of varied emotional states, of flickering neurotic tendencies, et cetera, et cetera.
What about all the stuff around? Because if we talk about contemplation, when you come from the point of view of Tibetan Buddhist traditions, you have all the things around. You have the sadhanas, but you also have the basic, the teaching on the motivation, the refuge, the compassion practice, then very central as a motivator or as a driving force, devotion to develop, you might say, states of detachment or being able to go into meditative states that kind of break through, that kind of open up new ways of seeing. So, how are you also translating those aspects when we go beyond the instructions of how to sit, how to contemplate, how to meditate, but how you see those aspects? Can they also be translated into our context?
Yeah, no, great question. Thank you, Marco. I think that so one of the things that is happening in the field is that people are starting to take a look at worldviews and how worldviews shape persons' experiences undergoing different contemplative practices. Another interesting line of research that's emerging is actually taking the training in worldviews on its own terms as something to undergo. So this gets called mindset training. And there's some interesting studies happening now at other labs. And I've also been thinking about this in different ways that there's a classic set in the Tibetan tradition, Ta Gom Chud, that is to say, view,
Hmm.
meditation, conduct. And there's also debates within the tradition, at least early, it sort of became formalized in that manner, Ta Gom Chud. But you find that early uh, sequences sometimes put meditation before view. Conduct always seems to come towards the end, which is kind of behavior in the world, makes sense. And there's an interesting kind of dialectic here between one's view of the world, one's worldview, philosophical, but also just how one sees the world, very in plain, in a plain sense, in a colloquial sense, and how that informs what one practices. And this doesn't just mean in session practice, although it typically does. However, it can mean other types of contemplative practices as well. But the point here is that there's a dynamic here that's very interesting. And if we look at practices in the Tibetan tradition, such as the Lojong training, which is not a meditation practice per se, where you sit on a cushion, although you could, but it's not typically how it's practiced. Instead, it's a set of slogans. And those slogans are slogans that you take up in your life and you memorize them and you know, bring them up in your life whenever they seem appropriate. And there's different ways to sort of file them and have them randomly appear or look at them when they seem most suitable, etc. Nonetheless, it's a kind of intentional reflection, consideration, contemplation on a very discrete phrase. And that phrase is designed to set your mind in a very particular outlook, in a very particular worldview. And the more you do this, the more you work with a particular slogan, the more you become familiar with seeing the world in that way. A classic which comes from the slogan, the Lojong slogans, but we also find in the dream yoga literature, for instance, which is see the world as an illusion. So, if you're a dream yoga practitioner or a practitioner of these mind training slogans, you will say to yourself throughout waking life, oh, this world is just an illusion. Oh, see how that was just like an illusion, and so forth. And what this does is in the lucid dreaming literature, in the contemporary lucid dreaming literature, this is called a reality check. And it's a mind training, a mindset training that we get from these traditions about how to remind yourself recurrently about your perceptions of the world. And if you do so over and over again with waking consciousness, both in your dreams, you'll recognize more easily the claim is a dream to be a dream because you'll have familiarized yourself with what it's like to be in a dream. But the claim is also that while awake, you start to perceive your waking world more like a dream, more dreamlike. And that has all sorts of psychological flexibility effects.
So, sort of undermining the general perception of oneself and the world around by introducing a new idea, but on a deeper level, so
Yes.
that coming back to this putting into question of the general state and the general perception of oneself and the world around, it looks like this seems to make the general rather solid perception crumble bit by bit and turn it around, like you say. But when very nice example that when you kind of wake up in the dream state and see that you're dreaming, that you also see that the daytime can be dreamlike and not as solid. And I mean, I think for all of us, this is quite a, seeing things as pretty solid in life and taking them extremely serious can be a great source of despair also. Can be a wish for a lot of stability, but if this stability is not perceived or not gained, actually the opposite might be the case.
Right.
So that's the way I perceive it.
Yeah. So in this way, mindset training is a kind of practice, considered more an exercise that one would perform throughout their day in incremental manner. And that gradually has an effect of transforming one's view of the world. So that's an example where there isn't this kind of strict sequence of meditation and view, right? View of meditation.
Mhm.
In fact, they're used in this rather coupled manner where you're actually cultivating mindset through a training practice.
Mhm.
And those can be quite effective, actually. In fact, very effective.
And when you speak of mindset, and it reminds me very much of the view, like in Mahamudra and like Dzogchen traditions, you have a strong diction of the view and very extensive explanation how the view is to be implemented and what the view consists of. And how do you translate the view then? I mean, like in a non-soteriological environment, or do you feel the need to be in a division of religious and secular, or you say we leave this behind completely?
A worldview, right?
In the view as I know it from many scriptures and from practice, it of course has a lot of Buddhist content and a lot of preconceived content about how the mind is to be directed, how things are to be seen. And seeing everything as an illusion might be a very unrestricted way, but like if you would say seeing everything as inherently pure, tamche yene dakpa or something, everything, all phenomena are inherently pure from the beginning. That might upset some people because if you have a strong belief in a distinction of purity and impurity, then everything being pure beyond concept might not float your boat, might not inspire you, or might even trigger certain internal religious conflicts. So, is there a way of translating this without triggering this, or you say, okay, that we can leave this behind? It's like an old story to even think like this and to feel the need to satisfy minds who cling to those divisions of religious and non-religious, for example.
Well, we're working with the mind. And if there's a mindset that someone has a resistance to, or a critique of, or some unwillingness to perceive the world that way, then that in itself is very interesting, right? There's not a kind of, we're not forcing people to have a philosophical view per se, and we're not giving kind of, philosophical lessons or metaphysical lessons. We're not making soteriological claims. Instead, you know, what I'm talking about is more at the level of how they orient their ordinary daily perception of themselves in a world and relate to other beings, relate to circumstances that happen in their life. So it becomes this very intimate way to relate with one's own mind. without really having to adapt a whole kind of worldview as far as a cosmology or a broader kind of cultural vision or a philosophical vision. Now, please hear me when I say this. It doesn't mean that those are not contextually important. They absolutely are. In fact, I think we need to do a better job, as I was saying earlier, in understanding context with environmental context, in understanding people's philosophical understandings, their metaphysical beliefs, their cultural beliefs, their cosmological orientations, et cetera, et cetera. Those are those are critical. And those are all part of this training process per individual. In other words, they will, on an individual basis, make those decisions or make those kind of discretions, discernments. It's not about sort of orienting people towards a religion or some kind of, broader orientation in the world, but it is about orienting them towards their own minds.
But I would think that definitely some views, worldviews, you might, as you say, that are more conducive to the development of contemplative practices and states than others.
There are. Absolutely agree with that. Yes. In fact, I think there are worldviews that are that make contemplative ways of being in the world quite challenged.
And your attendees, they start as the attendees of the program. They start from scratch by zero, or you have
Oh
a,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's different studies I'm involved in. But most of like the nature study I mentioned, just to keep to that as one example, is all naive meditation practitioners. They're all young adults. They're essentially college students at the University of Virginia. Yeah.
Mhm. So you're not applying these studies like you would say you have like uh,
We're not looking at advanced meditators in this.
exactly, like you don't have like
It's
pros and semi-pros and amateurs and so on, but you start with people who are pretty new and unspoiled by their meditation.
in this particular study, the nature study. That's correct. Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. So one of the things we do is so we give them a sense of, you know, through the meditation practice that we guide them. And in the very beginning, before they even are introduced to the practice, an orientation of how to sit with their body and their mind in a way that is non-reactive and just elementary orientation, just to sort of sit utterly and totally relaxed in a way that your eyes are open, your ears are open, all your sense faculties are wide open. And whatever you experience, whether it be a sound or a sight or a thought or a sensation on the body, et cetera, that you just allow that to come and go. And that kind of open allowance is something that people get used to. But at the beginning, we've found, interestingly enough, that at least within this young adult population, they already have preconceived understand notion of what meditation is, and they think it's all about focusing. If you notice, my instructions had nothing to do with focusing. And yet they continually, when you ask them what they were doing, they were saying, "Oh, I was focusing on my breath, or I was focusing on my mind, or I was trying not to think." So it's very interesting, actually, these naive so-called meditators, most of them never meditated in their life. When you give them meditation instructions, they do something entirely different based on their own preconception of what meditation is.
You mean this is kind of the overarching discourse that they already have been exposed to?
Yeah, yeah. So we actually have a control group that we call conventional mindfulness control group, where we teach people basically what conventional mindfulness, sitting and watching their breath and so forth, and to do comparisons. And it's very interesting to find how people receive instructions, how people, what are people actually doing when they say they're meditating or when they're pretending to meditate, etc. That's one of the questions we actually that we're very interested in. And that's one of the ways that phenomenology um, helps us understand what are people actually doing when they're given instructions, like guided through a practice in a very succinct, deliberate way. And they're doing something entirely different.
It's also the way the habits go. Like if you have such an open practice as you describe it, where you let everything happen and everything go, and there's like almost no center to it. Of course, I think immediately the mind will find its ways to go try to find habitual ways if you're exposed to
Yes,
like trying not to do anything. This is kind of wild. I
it's
mean,
very wild.
yeah.
And
I
and
not in the outrageous sense, like wild, but it's wild because it's the one thing that you never do, like
yeah. So that's one of the features that we're tracking in the study. So we track measures of immersion, how close they feel to being immersed or deeply embedded in the environment in which they're in. But the other one is mind wandering, or what gets called spontaneity of mind. So we're looking at measures around uh, spontaneity of mind. We're working with my colleague here named Zach Irving in the Department of Philosophy, who has a model of mind wandering that we're using. So, what we're very interested in is how minds wander in different environments, given a practice that invites them to be receptive in a receptive mode to whatever's happening within their minds and bodies, but also within the environments in which they're situated.
and you feel that naive meditators, I mean, that would be my sense that naive meditators also for a phenomenological study might have a greater openness in just sharing what their actual sentiment is, as if they had you might say, religiously preconceived idea of what they're supposed to deliver by their practice. I mean, that would be my impression that a naive practitioner would actually be much more willing to expose his or her own true happenings because there's no set context of having to produce something that is already preconceived or that is already a matter of aspiration.
Well, as I was saying a moment ago, we're finding the opposite, that in fact they do have preconceptions of what they think they're supposed to do during meditation
Yeah.
that are not what we are guiding them through. And that's what they report doing. And that is fascinating.
What I was more thinking about is that they still freely share what is actually happening for them without having to, for example, having to comply or having to tell you that they did exactly what you told them.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
this what I wanted to say, that they are not trying to be especially good at parroting what you had, like what you had given them as an instruction, because they don't feel the need to like make you happy or make their spiritual teacher happy. That was my idea.
yeah, it's an interesting question. I have to say the population that I work with is very eager to please.
Mm,
They
okay.
they are very driven to, and I think in their young adult lives are very much put in positions where they're trying to impress and please and sort of make their way, through college and into the real world, so to speak, and they're very much prepared for that at that point in their life, and they're thinking in those terms, and how that translates to something like a meditation experience is fascinating.
And so you actually make them sit in also in traditional meditation postures, or you leave it up to them however they sit. You basically go to the mind instruction.
Yeah, we give some fundamental instructions on how to sit upright and relaxed. So there's not a strict posture that they need to take, but we provide cushions and we give instructions on how to sit upright and relaxed.
And this, I think, is the first step you're doing. So you have a second step when you have some results. Where do you go from there? Is there,
The nature study?
yeah, let's take this for example, the nature study. Do you try to come to a point where you can actually reconstruct out of this sort of a translated model where you translate the instructions and the research results that you have gathered into a practice that can be newly applied, or is
Yeah.
that the goal?
Yeah, wonderful. So this particular study is interested in how among young adults, college students in the University of Virginia, uh, practice this particular open sensorial meditation style within different environments. And then from that, what we're interested in understanding is measures around immersion, how immersed they felt between themselves, their self body complex, and the environment in which they're situated, which condition they were in. And then, as I mentioned, measures around attention and mind wandering. Once the study concludes, which we're conducting now, we will evaluate the practice and the outcomes per condition. We'll plan on publishing several papers out of it, and we will then take that and look at how to develop a program here at the Contemplative Sciences Center with my colleagues who run student programming that is based on and informed by this kind of experiment. So we'll have an evidence-based nature program rather, based on this study. And that will be run through the Contemplative Sciences Center, and it'll be for undergraduate students here at the university. This particular study is designed to understand the highest level of well-being impact for young adults in the broader nature connection. Um, yeah,
Mm.
so that's what this particular study is set up to do. So looking at different as the study develops and as we develop it into a program, an extracurricular program that will then be for young adult well-being in connection to nature.
Mhm. So this will then completely integrate, if they wish so, into the curriculum.
Yeah, and we have a larger climate anxiety initiative here at the university. So we're also very interested in what gets called climate anxiety. And one of the measures is also one of the self-report measures that we're interested in teasing out is levels of climate anxiety, how anxious individuals feel in relationship to the climate crisis, and how, if exposed and having different degrees of exposure to nature in these different conditions, that either affects or does not affect, and to what extent their self-report measures around climate anxiety. So it's also connected to a broader climate anxiety initiative. Because
So,
it's not well known in the literature. So there's an emerging body of literature around what I'll just call nature connection and what it is to spend time in nature and well-being, particularly mental health effects around being in nature, nature walks and so on and so forth. There's an interesting body of literature there. And there's a few scales that have been developed to report nature connection and ecological belonging and so on and so forth. And of course, there's a emerging now significant body of research literature on meditation. However, there's really very little studies on meditation in nature, and particularly a contemplative practice designed to be open to the natural environment. So we're looking to fill that gap. We're also interested, as I mentioned, around the climate anxiety in thinking through the problem that is also not well articulated in the climate anxiety literature, which is if one does spend a lot of time in nature in a way that processes in an open manner the environment, that will have any effects on reducing climate anxiety. There are claims to that extent that are being made, and that is certainly plausible, but it doesn't mean that there's causality. So one of the things that we're looking at, I don't know that we'll be able to make a claim around direct causality either, but nonetheless, we are looking at that dynamic.
mhm. Some of the things I can see from a very simple point of view that is entirely non-academic. When I had my kids going to forest kindergarten, that's when they were in this age, they were just so relaxed and happy.
Yeah.
And once they got to school, of course, they have the pressure from like performing at school, but at the same time, they don't get out of the concrete jungle anymore. And I don't think it does them as well as the forest did. So I can see this for myself as well. Every other day I have to get out of the city and go to somewhere where it's green. And I think it greatly benefits my well-being.
Yeah.
And in relation to meditation practice, of course, I think in older or not particularly ancient environments, but like even if you go to Tibet a few years ago, nature was omnipresent, so there wasn't a big thing to talk about in general. I think there was like one of my Tibetan friends, he said when he was living in Kham, they would just like lie under the open sky and fall asleep while looking at the stars on the roof of their house. And he hated to sleep in the house. He just took every opportunity to sleep outside. And he's a very, very sane, very healthy person. I think that benefited him a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, increasing exposures to nature we know is good for us, and yet finding discrete contemplative practices that can most effectively enhance and optimize those exposures in nature is what we're interested in.
Yeah, this is so interesting and so wonderful that you share this with us. And I think for today, I would like to close the podcast because we could go on for so much longer, and there's many more things I know that you know, and I know that I can involve you talking about, like the great perfection tradition and completion state practices that you're looking into, and the Yang Tea tradition, and whatever else. So I think for today that would completely explode the framework of the podcast. But thank you so much, Michael, for today.